Latin American and Caribbean affairs. Before taking his current position, he served in a number of key military positions, including the United States Central Command, as commander of the 76th Operational Response Command Infantry, and as deputy commander for mobilization and reserve affairs for the Southern Command. He has been deployed 5 times to Iraq, 3 times to Afghanistan, and spent 17 years in South America, which included 12 years in Brazil. He graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in engineering from the U.S. Military Academy, earned his master's degree in public administration from Webster's University, a Bachelor's of Arts degree in history and Portuguese at Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar, and a doctorate in international relations from Columbia University. He has written 4 really fine historic military books based upon Latin America and Army experiences, including Wars Then and Now, In War's Shadow, Waging Peace in Central America, the Army and Low Intensity Conflict, and In War's Shadow at the Edge of the Cold War. He is a recipient of a long list of awards, and I won't name them all because we want him to have full time, but they include the Defense Superior Service Medal and the Bronze Star with an oak leaf cluster. General, we are thrilled that you joined us this morning.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Carla, and good morning, everyone. Before I begin, I want to thank the CAF Development Bank, the Inter-American Dialogue, and the Organization of American States for hosting this event and bringing together so many leaders and experts to discuss the opportunities and challenges facing the Western Hemisphere. Now, if you heard my bio description there, you're wondering, how could I do all of that? Well, I happen to be an Army reservist, so I was living in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and doing my reserve duty in Iraq and Afghanistan every year. So I used to talk particularly to students, and I was mentioning this to the Ambassador before. I would say, I'm kind of the face of globalization. I live in Brazil. I was working at that time, most of that time, for a British company, and yet I was deploying from Brazil to Iraq and Afghanistan. So it's kind of a scary portfolio, but that's the world we live in today. I'm delighted to be here today to represent the White House and to share some remarks with you. And as you can imagine, I get to read prepared remarks, okay? But I will take questions at the end of it. Okay, once I get through the suffering, we'll do the questions. Okay. First off, the President's actions show that this administration cares deeply about the Western Hemisphere. The region and our partnerships are a key priority for this administration. From the 5 presidential visits that have already occurred at the White House and the more than a dozen presidential phone calls to heads of state in Latin America, to the Vice President's trip to Central and South America just last month, and all the conferences and exchanges in between, it's clear that our administration understands that the region's security and prosperity directly affects our own here at home. It's worth taking a moment to explore how we arrived at this point in time. We are fortunate that we have a positive story to tell in the hemisphere. The values of freedom, democracy, prosperity, and security have truly taken hold in the hemisphere over the last 35 years. 35 years ago, much of this hemisphere was marred by dictatorships and protracted insurgencies that promoted failed ideologies, killed hundreds of thousands, and stifled the Western Hemisphere's true potential. With few exceptions, we have seen peace and democracy flourish across the region in those intervening 3 decades. And market economies are boosting the living standards for tens of millions. The numbers speak for themselves. According to the IMF, The hemisphere's purchasing power increased sevenfold since 1980. In Central America, as an example, where insurgencies once raged and have now ended, and stable political systems have been established that allow for market-oriented economies to take root, purchasing power increased tenfold. Furthermore, GDP growth has been consistent around or above 4% each year in Central America, despite all the problems that are still there, 4% since 2010, according to the IMF. Success like this demonstrates how opportunities emerge from investing in peace, empowering the people, and making reforms that encourage growth and competition. This progress stands in stark contrast to those few countries in the world who cling to failed ideologies and are moving backwards or are stagnated. The United States public and private sectors have invested in the Western Hemisphere region and will continue to do so because this strategy works and provides positive results. The region's embrace of democracy and the power of free market principles has strengthened the bonds between our countries. As the Vice President said in Argentina last month, our hemisphere's interests are intertwined and our futures are forever linked. Indeed, as a former Minister of Defense from a Latin American country recently told a delegation of U.S. flag officers that was visiting, he put it this way: you Americans need to understand that we are moving beyond mere common interest to shared values. Now, we realize that our fates will rise or fall together and that we must work together to ensure continued security and prosperity for our people. As a result, we are pursuing our priorities and securing our vital interests in the Western Hemisphere in close coordination with our partners. For example, the President recently ordered the creation of an aggressive strategy to dismantle the criminal cartels that have spread all across our nation. The President and this administration know, however, that to be successful in this endeavor, we must work closely with our partners in Mexico and throughout Central America to aggressively pursue the criminal organizations, their networks, and their illicit finances. Make no mistake that our progress against the MS-13 gang and other organizations here in the United States would not be possible without our partners in the region. We will continue to provide the tools, training, and support needed for the rule of law to continue to combat organized crime. Likewise, we must continue together to target the drug trade as part of that effort. The President is committed to fighting the drug addiction problem here in the United States and has promised, in fact, to break the dangerous habit that we have and is putting substantial funds towards that end. But we must continue to work with our Central American and South American partners to target the narcotics trade, both at its source and in transit north towards our borders. And we also have to recognize that quite a few Latin American countries also have a significant consumption problem of their own now. After all, it's worth recognizing that the fighting over these transit routes and distribution nodes is what causes the deaths of so many people across particularly Central America and Mexico as the drugs transit to the north. Of course, we are alarmed by the recent record numbers of coca cultivation in Colombia and opium poppy cultivation in Mexico, both of which have been on the rise now for several years. And we urge our Colombian and Mexican counterparts to take the lead in eradicating the narcotics problem at its source, and we are committed to doing all we can to support them. Both of these countries have been valuable partners for training of security forces across the region, and we hope that with Colombia's historic peace agreement with the FARC now being implemented, that we may have greater resources to devote towards denying safe haven for narcotics production across Mexico and the source countries in South America. While we are concerned with the destructive effect of drugs on our people, another corrosive agent also threatens to undo the progress we have achieved, and that is corruption, which, if unchecked, could erode the foundations that uphold our democratic systems and the open markets that have fueled so much growth across the Western Hemisphere. The scale of this problem is staggering, as we saw from the largest scandal in the region, Operação Lava Jato, which is not just a Brazilian problem. The tentacles reach into several countries and across continents. We have made much progress, but we still face challenges in ridding our hemisphere of corruption, and our administration welcomes the robust discussion hosted by this conference on this important topic. That we are willing to discuss corruption openly underscores our collective interest in finding solutions to address and solve the problem. And we look forward to any recommendations that may come from the discussions here. And we commend Peru for having all of us focus on democratic governance as a means to fight corruption during the Summit of the Americas that Peru will host next spring. Open discussions like these are important not only for solving shared problems, but also for ensuring that our trade partnerships are as effective and productive as they can be. As the Vice President observed in Chile last month, the United States is the largest trading partner for 2/3 of this hemisphere, and our trade across the hemisphere last year, U.S. trade, was more than double our trade with China. In terms of exports, we export almost 5 times as much to Mexico, Canada, and the rest of the hemisphere as we do to China. Latin America, meanwhile, has doubled its direct investment in the United States since 2008 at a pace that is still gathering steam. And we are thrilled that Argentina will be hosting the G20 next year, as this reinforces South America's significance in the world and as a trading partner for the United States. While we have shared the success of growing trade, we should not take this for granted. We can always do better. And that is precisely what our President intends to do as we modernize NAFTA with Canada and Mexico. We are in agreement that NAFTA needs updating. The world has changed significantly since this agreement came into effect 23 years ago, and so have our economies. We must account for important aspects of international trade that simply did not exist in 1994, but are indispensable in our highly digitized and interconnected world today. NAFTA needs to modernize to remain relevant, boost our competitiveness, and address trade imbalances. As Ambassador Lighthizer, our trade representative, said in his opening remarks at NAFTA last month, we must also develop provisions for NAFTA that can be used far into the future and that are flexible to account for future innovations. Only then can NAFTA bring us freer, fairer, and reciprocal trade, as well as deeper ties with our partners over the longer term. Finally, amid an overall good news story that we are promoting within our hemisphere, I would like to share some thoughts on the most glaring crisis that faces us in the Western Hemisphere today, and that is Venezuela's descent into dictatorship and its self-inflicted downward spiral economically. The Venezuelan regime's behavior is repugnant and contrary to the forward progress we have seen across the rest of the region. Under the Maduro regime, Venezuela's economy has contracted by 26% since 2014, and inflation is well known to be somewhere near 720% or higher, figures that are worse than our Great Depression. Although we have discussed the Western Hemisphere growing prosperity and increased standards of living, we see the polar opposite in Venezuela. It should be unthinkable that basic foodstuffs and medicine would run scarce in this hemisphere anywhere in 2017. In a similar way, we should never have such a humanitarian crisis unfolding as we do now in Venezuela, as Venezuelans seek asylum across the region. But that is the sad reality of this man-caused disaster. By any reasonable metric, the regime has failed the Venezuelan people and is turning Venezuela into a failed state. What was once one of South America's most prosperous nations is now one of its poorest and one of the world's most corrupt. The President has made his sense of urgency very clear on resolving this crisis, and we have taken several steps of our own to punish the regime and the members of the regime while still trying to support the Venezuelan people. And we are glad to see that the region is unified in calling on the Maduro regime to restore democracy and basic freedoms. Brazil, for example, was instrumental in expelling Venezuela from Mercosur, and we applaud the 12 countries that came together to sign the Lima Declaration. These are unmistakable signs that the Western Hemisphere does not tolerate the path that Maduro has chosen. If we wish to successfully avoid a second dictatorship taking hold in our hemisphere, we must see more action from all of us. Everyone gathered here should consider what we can do to effect positive change in Venezuela while there's still time. But as we discussed earlier, the continued security and prosperity of our region is a responsibility that we all share. And now is certainly no time for hand-wringing. Although we face challenges, the Western Hemisphere has significant cause for optimism. We are more connected by ideas, values, and economics than ever before. Our bonds are strong, and opportunities exist to make the 21st century a century of prolonged prosperity and lasting security across North, Central, and South America. The Western Hemisphere has a committed partner in this president and his administration to make that happen. Thank you. And now I'll take some questions. Okay. Anybody?
Other questions, just raise your hand.
Yeah.
There's one.
Who wants to be the first victim? Yes. Okay.
Yes, sir. Evan Ellis, U.S. Army War College. First of all, thank you for your service, General.
Yeah.
Wanted to ask you, with respect to the range of tools that the United States has, both on the State Department side as well as military engagement and the security cooperation programs within the region, and clearly the state partner programs of the National Guard. As you look at the range of tools that we have, as we try to continue to be a partner of choice to the region, maintain governance, good governance, maintain prosperity, particularly in light of other alternatives offered by China, Russia, et cetera. What do you see as some of the tools which perhaps have been underutilized or which could be utilized more or differently in this environment of scarce resources to more effectively be that partner of choice?
Okay, great question. I think, at least in the military, we always talk about 4 elements of power, right, that we have: diplomatic, information, military, and economic. And so your question would be, which ones could we use more or better? For really the last 35 years, we have actually focused very heavily on the diplomatic and the economic side of the house. Not so much on the military, except in the partnership building arena, building partner capacity. It's probably astounding that we have such a deep relationship with most countries in the region now on the military side of the house in a cooperative way. For those of you familiar with Southern Command, twice a year at least they'll have large exercises that are mandated by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. One of those brings together anywhere from 15 to 20 of the hemisphere's countries to participate, and we parcel out the major subordinate commands to partner nations. So your combined forces land component command will be often a Brazilian. The maritime command will rotate among the other nations of the hemisphere. Our problem, when we look at other competitors, Russia and China, you have to ask what it is they have to offer. The Russians have military equipment predominantly to offer, but of course the record of that is different. When we sell military systems, we often require the recipient country to buy the logistics package that goes with it. Because if you sell a sophisticated military system without the logistics and maintenance package, you often end up with a very nice looking monument on a pedestal, because after a few months or a couple of years, the system doesn't work anymore. And that's the problem with the Russian systems. They have a tendency to just want to sell it. They don't sell the supporting infrastructure that goes with it. It makes our equipment more expensive because you're buying the logistical tail to go with it. The Chinese, on the other hand, they offer our version, or their version rather, of international military education and training. But you can imagine going to Beijing or some other place in China to take a year or two of military education in maybe Mandarin. It's a difficult proposition. It's easier to get people to come here. Economically, the Chinese have an advantage, one could say, in that they have a large number of state-owned enterprises that take direction from either the party or the state. And sometimes, with the Chinese, it's difficult to determine whether it's the party or the state that actually are giving the orders. We don't have that, and we'll never have that. It's interesting, we hosted a Brazilian delegation military delegation in Southern Command a couple of years ago, right after the Brazilians had returned to oil bid rounds. And they got exactly one bid in their bid round, and it was a consortium of a UK and a Chinese company, about 51 UK, 49% Chinese. And so they asked us, why did you Americans not bid? Well, the question is, which Americans? Because we don't have a state-owned oil company. I mean, is it Chevron? Is it Exxon that you wanted to bid? Is it Anadarko, Apache? You name the dozens of companies that could have bid. So the question isn't, why did you Americans not bid? The question really becomes, what were the bidding parameters that would have attracted significant private investment from the rest of the world? The UK company was there because they had been shut out of the previous bid rounds, and they were, relatively desperate to get into a very hot prospect. The Chinese were there because the Chinese need natural resources. Okay, so on the economic front, what we have to offer is if you will, a continued commitment. It's kind of hard to do what we've done harder. Okay, but a continued commitment to a rules-based order. That says you need to have open markets, you need to have clear, enduring regulatory regimes that allow for the innovation domestically and the importation of capital and know-how from abroad on a commercial basis. The Chinese will necessarily act in a mercantilist way. So it's really that shared system of values that we're talking about across the hemisphere that we have to reinforce, if you will. But that's doing the same thing harder, right? Okay. Information, we could probably do better on information. But again, the United States normally, we don't have a propaganda ministry. And we don't want one. But we do have to do a better job, I think, of extolling the benefits and the positive responses. I still go to a lot of Latin American conferences, and if you're not careful, it lapses into the discussion that sounds like it did 35 years ago, if you're not careful, which is not true, all right? The hemisphere has fundamentally changed for the better in 35 years, but if you're not careful, it's almost like sackcloth and ashes at these conferences where people talk about how bad things are, and it's kind of like I had the same, many of the same people work for me for 15 years in Brazil. And they had moved up the economic ladder tremendously in that time as individuals, these Brazilians. But if you listen to them as they were talking on their cell phones, as they were Facebooking, as they were shopping online for a new TV, they would talk about how bad things were. 15 years before, none of that existed. So we have a tendency, to talk down things when we maybe ought to talk them up, and that's the eye of information. And that's why conferences like this are so important, okay? Because most of you that have been involved in Latin America, you know the progress that has been made, notwithstanding the challenges that remain. I hope that answered your question. Okay, that gives you a footnote. You can take that back, put it in your War College thesis. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, General. My name is Marta Lucia Ramirez from Colombia, and I would like to know your perspective about Maduro's militias. He's arming this civilian population. He was preparing some military activities 2 weeks ago. So how is your perspective about these Bolivariana militias? Of course, it was installed by Chavez many years ago. And if you believe that some foreign people in Venezuela, maybe some Russians, some people from Cuba, could have a kind of a threat for Colombia's security and maybe security in the region, because as you know, they invest a lot of money in armament and a lot of armament. So you believe that it could create a kind of a threat security?
Yeah, I think the thing that should concern us all about the militias is, it's not unusual in dictatorial regimes to have party troops, right, that operate outside of the formal structure. So just to use an example, in the old Noriega regime, they had the dignity battalions, if you got popular dignity battalions. So the reason those are dangerous is because they become tools of repression domestically. They're not particularly useful in a national defense role. They become more useful in an internal repression role. So to the extent that you see those things grow, particularly in a nation that, like Venezuela right now, that has a fair amount of social fracturing, we should be worried about them from the humanitarian side of the house and what they might do if things continue down the path they are, with threats to the opposition, threats to anybody in the street who opposes the Maduro regime. That would be our concern. And then you'll have spillover effects on bordering countries, mainly from the humanitarian people fleeing the conflict, right? Which would be something that we see time and again around the world as states fail, in the progressive sense of the term, failing before they reach the failed state. Okay. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Ola Gitkin. I'm with Tellurian, and we're building LNG export facility in Louisiana. And I wanted to ask you how you think about energy security of our allies in Latin America, and if there are any concrete steps to promoting the use of American gas.
Okay. I find fascinating. Of course, I work for, in my day, the BG Group, which is now part of Shell, and we liked to think of ourselves as pioneers in Latin American LNG. We, along with the Napa, Chile, in Desa, Chile, built the first LNG regasification import terminal in Quintero in Chile back at the end of the last decade. We also... Say again? Oh, yes, of course. Yeah, so give Martin my regards. Yeah, and Martin was involved in that, as well as floating LNG regasification in Bahia de Guanabara in Rio de Janeiro, the first one of those in the hemisphere. So I think what I would say is, when you look at energy security, the question is the diversity of resources, so that you're not dependent upon one single source of energy. LNG, as it moves down the cost curve, will certainly be part of that. LNG from the United States, now that we've freed up so much of the gas that's available to us, will be part of that. When we were putting in Quintero LNG, we were going to source it out of Trinidad and Tobago. We're going to source it out of Egypt, and potentially as well out of Australia, as we were building liquefaction plants in all of those locations. So if I were on the receiving side in a South American country, I would look for that diversity of source. And certainly the U.S. would be one of those, just distance-wise more than anything else. Because for all of you that deal in energy, you know that there is a transport cost, so the closer the better. I hope that answered your question. I think it's a viable, certainly a viable option that must be considered. I don't think you'll have any trouble selling your LNG. Okay. Right, it's a question of price. Yes, in the back there.
Thank you. I'm John Hansen with the United States Agency for International Development. We talk a lot about the interface between diplomacy, development, and defense in our national security strategy and our interface with countries, especially with the increasing interest in Latin America and focusing on countries like Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, the Northern Triangle. But the resources that we have, including our defense partnerships, are really trifling in comparison to the private sector resources that are being invested in the region.
Right.
And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about how we can best leverage the private sector to help us attain goals that that achieve greater security, greater peace, stability, and prosperity in Latin America? Right.
That's a fantastic question, because I think I hate to say it because it makes us sound so old, but 17, 18 years ago, Andrew Natsios, the former administrator of USAID, wrote really a fascinating article which said that of the money available to invest in the developing countries of the emerging markets, 80+% was private. Okay, and less than 20% was multilateral or bilateral aid. Latin America has been a beneficiary of much of that private sector capital. And I'm happy to say that I spent most of my 17 years in South America, all of my 17 years working down there, bringing private capital in for major transformative infrastructure projects. And so it's doable, but it begins with that system, if you will, of laws and regulations that allow for the investment of capital and to earn and repatriate profits. Because Latin America has been on a transition, if you will, as we talked about, from dictatorship to democracy, from closed markets to open markets. And Brazil's an example that I'll use. When I started working in Brazil in 1994, I went to the Department of Commerce trade database that they had then. And it came on, some discs that were about this size. You'd get the trade database; they were gigantic. You had to have a special drive to use them. And it listed Brazil. Now the data was from 92. I was looking at it in 94, which in governmental terms is recent. And Brazil was still listed as one of the 10 most closed economies in the world. Now they had just made decisions with under the Itamar Franco and then the Cardozo administrations to open themselves up to the world. And so if you went back to the late 90s, as we were beginning our deep investment, Brazil would average about $20 billion per year in foreign direct investment in a continental-sized country with then about 180 million people. $20 billion is really not much, right? And it was generally single sector, and it was based on privatizations. When they would privatize a large chunk of the telecommunications sector, they'd get most of that $20 billion on one day. Or if they were privatizing oil and gas or electricity infrastructure, they would get most of that in a few auctions. By the time I left in 2011, Brazil was averaging between $40 and $60 billion a year of foreign direct investment, but it was multi-sectoral, everything from subway franchises to retail chains to continued investment in heavy infrastructure. But that was a reflection of the wholesale change in Brazilian laws and regulations that allowed that. Similarly, we saw that in other countries like Chile. Chile made a decision, a multi-party consensus, to be a trading nation, and at least when we were building Quintero LNG, they were telling us that they had over 100 trade agreements that they had signed around the world, and they were outwardly focused, Pacific focused primarily, but outwardly focused. They became a trading nation. You'll see that in different forms in most of the countries down there. To where that today, not only private capital in the country, but also capital inbound. But we all know what it is. You have to have laws that protect property. You have to have means of adjudicating within a reasonable period of time contractual disputes at law. If it takes 10 to 15 years to resolve a suit at law, then they're no good. All right? Means of arbitration short of a law using International Chamber of Commerce rules. Okay. It's also the means, again, of earning a profit legitimately and repatriating that profit as you would want. It's clear, transparently made, clearly understandable, stable and enduring regulations. The same as in this country. If the regulatory rules change every 2 to 4 years with electoral cycles, then it dampens investment. Doesn't end it, but it dampens it. So these are the things that really the hemisphere's worked on over the last 35 years. We have to embed them and sustain them going forward. You can look at the period of time that from early 2001 really until just recently in Argentina, and you can see the other side of those policies. If you don't adhere to contracts, if you don't pay bondholders, if you have a hostile climate for foreign investment, you just get less of it. You don't get none, you just get less. Or you go hat in hand to the Chinese, and that's not very good either. Okay, because they don't just make commercial loans to you. Okay, I've got time for one more question, and I'm sorry, I'm going to go this way because I've ignored my left-hand side over here. I'm sorry about that.
merely coincidental it was your left-hand side that you were ignoring?
So, I'm sorry?
I'm kidding.
Yeah.
Danny Freifeld from Callaway Capital. How would you characterize the administration's ultimate objective with respect to the sanctions on Venezuela? Is it to induce a change in behavior, or is it to induce a change in regime? And is that because you believe a default on the external debt is more likely to precipitate a change in regime? And I hope you sort of understand the duality of
Yes,
that sort of
I
a
do.
classic characterization of the objectives of sanctions. So is there what can we understand about what the ultimate objective is here? Thank you.
Yeah, it's behaviorally focused, right? We would like the Venezuelan regime to return to democratic processes, okay? We would like them to respect human rights. We would like them to respect property. And so that does not necessarily necessitate regime change, right? And regime change is awfully hard to bring about by economic sanctions. You know, it's almost the theory of the last chicken sandwich that Ambassador Thomas Pickering used to talk about, which is, you know, the strong man in his bunker normally doesn't feel the effects of sanction until the last chicken sandwich disappears, okay? And that's way down the line, okay? So what you're hoping is that the targeted sanctions that we and other nations have put on members of the regime and the regime finances induce them to change their behavior, okay? While also not unnecessarily or to any degree harming the Venezuelan people who are having difficulty finding food, toilet paper, toothpaste, and those other things that we all take for granted, okay? And similarly, not harming the opposition, the legitimate opposition that's out there, okay? So it's behaviorally based.
What would the consequence of the default be, or what do you think might be the consequence?
Yeah, well, I think all of us have seen Latin American defaults before, okay? So there will be some kind of debt shakeout. It's worthwhile noting that I think China owns about $60 billion of that debt backed by oil. It's kind of hard to see that ever getting paid in full. I mean, it'd be difficult if I was Chinese, if I were, you know, the Chinese central government or the party, I'm not sure how much more I'd lend them. Okay, it's just like whether it's the Chinese or anybody else, you got to worry at some point about being repaid. And with that, I must yield back to the ambassador, and I thank you very much for having me, and I do look forward to meeting some of you on my way out and talking a little bit more.
Well, I
Thank
know
you,
you
Ambassador.
join me in thanking the General. You were terrific.